Welcome to the Conservative Library. I'm Daniel McCarthy, Vice President for Publications at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. And today we're going to be talking about a new release from ISI Books that comes out on August 19. So depending on when you're watching this, it may be just about to be released or it may be newly out. It's called The Man Who Invented Conservatism, and it's a new biography, in fact a very revealing one, of Frank Meyer, who is one of the founding fathers, in fact arguably the philosophical founding father, of 20th century post-war American conservatism. The author is Daniel Flynn, and the book again is The Man Who Invented Conservatism. Tell us, why did that title come to your mind as something that would be appropriate for Frank Meyer? Who is Frank Meyer that he was someone who could claim to have invented conservatism?
Well, it almost has like a double or triple meaning. I mean, I think at first Frank thought you could invent conservatism, that it was not something that developed organically. And he came to the realization that that was, in fact, not the case. What he is known for primarily is Fusionism. And for sort of the uninitiated, Fusionism is a melding of traditionalism and libertarianism, bringing together what people thought of as two disparate groups. And the way he did this, I think because people saw that what he was doing was true, that it was simple, and that it had political utility, made for Fusionism to be kind of the default outlook of conservatives from, say, Goldwater through Ronald Reagan. Meyer essentially, with regard to Fusionism, that's sort of what he's known as. What I try to do in the book is show Frank Meyer as a person, that he is not just the personification of Fusionism, but he's a guy who led a dynamic life that pops off the page. And I think the prejudice for people is that these ideologues, these people that idea people, they lead very great lives. That was the farthest thing from Frank Meyer.
So Frank Meyer is present at the creation of the modern conservative movement with National Review, and he very quickly becomes an influential senior editor at National Review. He's the literary editor, but he's also writing a column called Principles and Heresies, which is basically laying out the party line in some respects, the more philosophical party line of National Review and of the nascent conservative movement. But your book shows this very fascinating other side of Frank Meyer, that in fact, Frank Meyer's own life is a kind of fusionism of a period when he was an idealistic communist, and then later when he becomes a conservative who is realistic, but also wants to, as you say, provide a philosophy, provide a consistent set of ideas for conservatism. How does he make that change? First of all, why does this young man become a communist in the first place? How does he snap out of it and then become not just a conservative, but in some sense, the conservative?
Yeah, just real briefly to touch on the other one. I mean, the other part of the title is that he is, as you say, president of the creation of National Review. He's president of the creation of the Conservative Party of New York. He is a founder of the American Conservative Union. The Philadelphia Society considers him a founding father. He is at the founding meeting of the Young Americans for Freedom. So the skeletal structure of the conservative movement, Frank Meyer has his fingerprints all over it. And that's part of the reason why I titled it that book. I titled the book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism. Frank comes to communism over a period of years. And I think part of it has to do with he is living a very socially isolated lifestyle, living in a high-hat hotel in Newark, New Jersey. He goes off to Balliol College, Oxford. All of the people that Marxism is claiming to champion, he doesn't have the occasion to really run into. When he is in England, the Depression starts to hit, and he decides to found something along with a fellow student called the October Club at Oxford. When he gets to Oxford, there are 0 communists there. When he leaves, there are over 300. He is on the board of the Communist Party of Great Britain. He's the secretary of the Student Bureau of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Strange that American would be that. And at a certain point, because of his communist activities, he finds himself to be a cause célèbre. He is debated on the floor of Parliament. Clement Attlee, who's the future prime minister, wants him to stay in England, and there's a movement to get him deported because of his activities. Meyer is subject of a petition that Bertrand Russell signs, that E.M. Forster, who wrote Passage to India and a lot of other novels, signs. There are students going through the streets of London chanting, "Free Frank Meyer, free Frank Meyer." This is a side of Frank Meyer I don't think people who read that Principles and Heresies column in National Review thought existed. And it's part of Meyer that he didn't really talk much about. So to be able to bring it out in a book, I mean, that to me is exciting. This is a guy who's been dead for over 50 years, and here's all this new information, not just about Frank Meyer, but about his colleagues at National Review, about the magazine, and about all sorts of figures of note in the 20th century.
Let's go back to the beginning. So even before Frank Meyer becomes a young communist, and in fact the leading young communist activist as an American in Britain, he is born around 1909, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And he's Jewish.
Yes.
Reform Judaism is important to his identity when he's young, but then he has a rebellious phase, which I'm very interested to hear about. And Frank goes from being someone who seems to be, rather faithful to his background, to a rebel, and in fact someone who admires even a certain image of Satan that he discovers in one of the classics of Western literature.
Sure. Yeah, the earliest article that I have found of Frank is from his temple, where he wrote in defense of Judaism and in defense of the Feast of I believe it's Sukkot, the Feast of the Tabernacles, I think it's called. And he talked about all these people saying that people are turning away from religion. Well, come to our temple and you'll see how many people there. And he's really full-throated defense of Reform Judaism. That's when he's 14. By the time he's 16, he writes an essay that wins an award at Newark Academy, where he's defending Bolsheviks, he's defending atheists. Clearly something had changed in Frank. He gets into Princeton after some resistance that Frank never knew about, but there's in the files at Princeton, there's a guy named Radcliffe Hermance, who was the head of admissions, who says, can't you send me someone else? This guy, there are many fine, clean-cut Christian Americans that are going to try to get into Princeton. Why do we have to admit this guy who doesn't even seem like a Jew of the better type? So he ran into this anti-Semitism, which he didn't see, but a school that is going to be that prejudicial and was known for being more prejudicial than the other Ivies, he's going to experience that within the student body. So he had a rough go of it. And I can't help but thinking that in his rebellion against all these sort of fine, clean Christian Americans at Princeton, that his embrace of Satan, to include writing poems about Satan, and it is sort of this Paradise Lost Satan. It's not like he's putting on a hood and putting out candles and things like that, but he's rebelling against the norm of Princeton, against the Christians that sort of hassle him, and he doesn't really have a good place on the campus. Something very different happens when he goes to Oxford. I mean, he does a real brash thing, a very Frank Meyer thing. Rather than go to the University of Wisconsin and some other schools that he was recommended to go, he says, no, I want to go to Cambridge or I want to go to Oxford. That seems to be an upgrade, that you want to go to Cambridge or Oxford from Princeton. I mean, Princeton's a great school, but if you drop out of Princeton, you're going to go to Oxford? Really? Well, that's what he did. And at Oxford, it's a very different scene for Frank. He gets involved in intramural sports. He's dating multiple women at once. He is, as some people say, he's the heart and the soul of the campus. I don't know that anyone has a better college experience at Oxford in all of that, 1,000-year history or 800-year history than Frank Meyer. So it turned around for him. But at the same time, as he told one of his sons, he faced a decision. He was either going to become a Catholic or to become a communist, which seems very odd, but they're both demanding faiths. And his tutor there, until he passed away, was a guy named Sliger Urquhart, who was apparently the basis for Mr. Samgrass in Brideshead Revisited. And he's the first Catholic on the faculty for, I don't know, since Queen Elizabeth's time. And Frank thinks, okay, well, maybe this Catholic thing. Well, he doesn't choose the Catholic thing. He chooses the communist thing. And as I said, his charismatic presence, the fact that he had all these friends, it goes from 0 student communist presence at Oxford to 300, and they start causing all sorts of mischief all over England, and this leads to Frank Meyer's deportation in 1934.
It goes to show how recurrent many of the themes that are roiling America right now, whether it's anti-Semitism, campus radicalism, deportation, these are all elements of Frank Meyer's life. I mean, it's an amazingly timely biography in some ways, although in a kind of funhouse mirror way, perhaps.
Yes, I think so. And I was talking about earlier today with, Frank had a charisma about him. And I think if you look at, one of the things that he did in Great Britain, for instance, he had an ongoing affair with Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald's daughter. Now, if you're a revolutionary, you want to overthrow the government of Great Britain, the idea that you're going to simultaneously go into 10 Downing Street and have an affair and have your social circle extend to the Prime Minister's family, boy, that's a very Frank Meyer thing to do. It's a very reckless thing to do. And Frank had this charisma about him where he could pull something like that off. Well, I mean, he gets deported, so I don't know how well he pulled it off. But at the same time, you had all these guys wanting to be his friend. A guy like James Michener writes him a letter. He gets to hang out with Frank and says, when are we going to hang out again? I long to sort of toast with you and drink. You're so great when you're drinking. I want to take a cook's tour of this part of the country with you. And Michener, I want you to recommend more books and I want us to be friends. And he's basically begging the guy, like, be my friend. It's rather pathetic. Michener obviously writes Tales of the South Pacific, which becomes Pulitzer Prize winner, becomes a play, one of the most well-known plays in American history. He's begging Frank Meyer to be his friend, and all these women are begging for his romantic attention. He has a certain charisma about him that I think is to overlook that as a factor in why he was able to be such an effective organizer as a communist and then such an effective organizer later as a conservative. I think you're really missing something if you do that. He changed his politics. But Frank Meyer was still the same guy. He still sort of radiated this energy that people wanted to be around. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was so effective. He was as effective as he was because people wanted to be around this guy. People were attracted to this
Let's
guy.
talk about the literary side of that magnetism. So you'd mentioned James Michener, the famous novelist. At a time when he's just teaching in a high school, he's encountered Frank Meyer, and he's been bowled over by Meyer's personality, by Meyer's reading. He's taking advice on what books to read and check out of the library from Frank Meyer. And then throughout Meyer's career, he has a close friendship with Eugene O'Neill Jr. He obviously knows Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, as well. Frank Meyer becomes the first person to publish Joan Didion, not just in National Review, but in fact the first person to publish any of her freelance
writing. As a freelancer, yeah, definitely. Yeah, he had he had a boldness about himself. So he was writing poetry, and in England, he went to T.S. Eliot and said, "What do you think of my poetry?" And T.S. Eliot, at least according to Meyer, gave him, kind of a favorable response. He may have been being kind, but Meyer's poetry was decent enough. But the idea that as a 21-year-old guy, 22-year-old guy, you're going to go up to T.S. Eliot and say, "Hey, read my poetry," that was Frank Meyer. And so when he met at 16 at Belgrade Lakes, which is the basis of on Golden Pond, he meets Eugene O'Neill Jr. He knows some guys that know him, and he sees him at a store, and they become fast friends. And the father, who was writing, I believe, the third of his 4 Pulitzer-winning plays in Loon Lodge, and he'll come out in the afternoon, go swimming with them. But he's talking about, he has Eugene O'Neill lend him his copy of Tristram Shandy. He talks Freud with him. They talk about the possibility of a war with the Japanese. They're doing this in 1926. They say, and O'Neill thinks, yeah, I think there probably is going to be a war with the Japanese. So he's having these intellectual conversations with someone who had already won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, was already famous, and at 16, he doesn't feel bowled over by this at all. And so he's very comfortable in that world from a very young age. And I would imagine that being wealthy, being a part of a famous family in Newark, all of this stuff led Frank to believe that, yeah, I belong here. I belong here to talking to Eugene O'Neill. Now, whether he belonged there or not is sort of beside the point. He felt that way.
Yeah, I mean, Frank Meyer comes from a kind of upper middle class background in Newark, New Jersey. And so he doesn't represent the proletarian stratum of society that he claims to champion as a communist. Was economics the main driver? Was a sense of economic guilt perhaps something that drove Meyer into communism? Or was it something else? Was it a desire to rebel and just be adventurous?
I think all of the above. His mother was heavily involved in the temple. She was heavily involved in Jewish charities. He rebelled against that by becoming an atheist. His father was a capitalist. He made, umbrellas and coats for raincoats, things like that. And he made a very good living. His father was very wealthy, and his mother came from an extremely wealthy family. Frank grew up in a hotel. Now it's a place where people on welfare live, but in 1922, it was the latest and greatest in all of the places in Newark, New Jersey. So Frank was isolated from working class people, and it wasn't until World War II happens and he joins the army where he finally meets the proletariat that Marx has been talking about. And he realizes, gee, these were not the proletariat that were described to be by Marx, and cracks in the armor start to happen for Frank while he's in the army.
Let's talk a little bit about his trajectory as a communist. So he goes to Britain. He becomes, he is the Jewish American communist who conquers Britain. He is the absolute,
Yes.
belle. He's the belle of the ball, if I may use a metaphor that perhaps is a little, unexpected. But he thrills, everyone he meets in England. But he gets deported, of course, because he is a communist subversive, quite literally. And he's not just a communist subversive. He's actually effectively building up communist organizations within British political institutions. And he's dating the prime minister's daughter, which has, I know you and I have talked privately about whether MI5, MI6 was concerned about that,
Sure.
as well as about the political implications of what Meyer was doing.
Yes.
But then he goes to Paris, I believe, or goes to France, and starts to work for Walter Ulbricht.
Yes.
Who becomes, of course, the man who builds the Berlin Wall. And then Meyer goes back to the United States. But in the United States, and I think this is going to be in the 1930s, if I'm correct, Meyer is part of a communist group that is, okay, they're the Communist Party USA, but they take the USA part seriously, at least, in terms of their marketing.
Yes.
I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about Meyer's involvement in this effort to Americanize communism.
Yeah, in the 1930s, there was a period in which there was a popular front, and there was a big slogan, communism is 20th century Americanism. And they tried to wrap up communism in the American flag. And then the Hitler-Stalin Pact happens. There was a University of Chicago professor, academic student at the time, Edward Shills, who remembers seeing Meyer the weekend that the news came out, and he looked despondent on a corner, and he said, Frank Meyer is not long for the Communist Party. Well, he was wrong. Frank stayed, and he had logic. He had these logical gymnastics games where he defended the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So he stayed through that, but not without misgivings. And in the 40s, there becomes an occasion to revive that communist is 20th century Americanism crusade from the 30s, because the Soviet Union becomes allies with the United States. Frank gets together with a guy named Louis Budens, who also became a famous witness against communists later. And they're scheming on how they can affect this change. And Frank writes a letter to Earl Browder, who's the head of the Communist Party, basically saying, listen, we're not going to attract bowlers if we keep hitting Marx. We need to wrap Marx up in Jefferson and Lincoln and all of our history. We need to wrap him up in the American tradition. We need to fuse Marxism with the American tradition. And we need to do that not just on the 4th of July, but every day of the year. And that way we will, once again, have large-scale support the way we did in the 1930s, because people in the 40s realized that they were kind of full of it, and they didn't have the popularity that they had before. Well, Browder says, I'm already on it. I'm doing that already. Now, whether he was influenced by Meyer or not, I don't know, but he does follow that course. The Comintern disbands ostensibly, and the American Communist Party ceases to be a party. It becomes a Communist Political Association, which Meyer promptly joins. They stop starting their meetings with the International played. They're sort of like communist national anthem, and they start playing the American national anthem. Browder is called no longer the general secretary. I believe he's called the president. They make all of these changes. For Meyer, he used to be the director of the Chicago Workers' School. And it's a very Marxist name. In New York, he becomes on the faculty of the Jefferson School. So in Boston, it's the Sam Adams School. And they all get this new makeover. Meyer, this extends his life in the Communist Party. And in this weird time where there was a little bit of freedom in the party, he actually writes a book review in New Masses of Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, the 1944 classic book. And it's not a uniformly positive review. You'd call it a mixed review, but it's very rare to see any sort of free market kind of book assessed in a generous way in a communist publication. If that review came out a week later, it would have been it would have been killed, because a week later, there's something called the Duclos Letter, where basically Stalin signals all of the Western parties, listen, a Cold War is coming, and all of this playing nice with capitalists and this alliance with Roosevelt and Churchill and all these people, that's over. This war is going to end, and we're going to be enemies with these people. Frank thinks this is Jacques Duclos writing. This is the French Communist Party telling you, so how dare these people? And Browder acts the same way. They got used to this freedom. They kind of went native with it. And pretty soon everyone realizes, no, this is from the Soviet Union. However much you liked this kind of Americanized Communist Party, you have to do what Stalin says. And Browder resists, and Frank Meyer resists. Browder is kicked out of the party in a rather zealous way, and they went on sort of a smear campaign against them. Frank kind of just slinks away. And as he's slinking away, the party comes to Elsie. And they say, Elsie, we think...
Elsie's his wife.
I'm sorry. Elsie is Frank's wife. And they got married in 1938. By 1944, they have their first kid, John, and later Gene Meyer, who was the founder of the Federalist Society, longtime president, they have him in 1952. And in 45, the Communist Party comes to Elsie and says, listen, Frank is drifting away. We think you're a good communist. Frank is unsalvageable. Divorce him, and you can stay in the party. Elsie loves Frank Meyer, and Frank Meyer loves Elsie. And she's like, no. And she didn't say no to them, but they're ready to leave. And they leave the party. But they do so not with the bang of Earl Browder. They do so with an uncharacteristic whimper for Frank Meyer. The bang would come a few years later, and he would revisit a revenge upon some of these people.
During the 1930s, Frank Meyer contemplated a fusion of Marxism and Americanism. And one of the things in your book, which I think many conservatives will find provocative, but also something that causes them to reflect and re-examine the history of the conservative movement, is that there are parallels between this fusionism of Marxism and Americanism that Frank Meyer had contemplated in the 1930s, and Frank Meyer's later idea, developed in the 1950s and onwards, of a fusionism of traditionalism and libertarianism, where basically both traditionalism and libertarianism, two versions of conservatism or two versions of right-of-center ideology, are in fact combined with Americanism, and the American tradition is seen as being not just a fusion, but actually an organic expression of both of these traditions. First of all, talk a little bit about Meyer's relationship with libertarians and with traditionalists and what those groups were. And second, how he came to revamp this idea that he perhaps had in embryo during his communist days and turn it into a conservative idea, fusionism, which then becomes basically the standard view of conservatism among people like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, and several generations, in fact, of conservative politicians, activists, and thinkers.
Yeah, I think Meyer wanted to force a square peg in a round hole with Marxism being part of the American tradition. He was smart enough, he was an ideologue, so he would often do ridiculous things like defend the Nazi-Soviet pact, but he was smart enough, he was a very intelligent man, to realize that Marxism doesn't go with the American tradition. And so that raises the question, what does? And that's the intellectual odyssey that he went on from the 1940s up until his death in 1972. And that led him to conservatism. If Marxism doesn't fit, what does? And what he thought was that, what is significant about America, the American tradition, is the founding. The Declaration, the Constitution, Washington's Farewell Address, the Federalist Papers, whatever you want to throw in there. The founding is what is different about America from other countries. And that tradition, what is its meaning? Well, its meaning is freedom. As one of his acolytes, Stan Evans, put on the title of his book, on the cover of a book years later, in the 1990s, the theme is freedom. And that book was basically applied fusionism, where he said, listen, freedom and tradition aren't in conflict, they're in cooperation. That you can't have freedom without thousands of years of tradition and Western civilization propping that up. It didn't just come out of the ether. And that's part of fusionism as well. And so Frank develops this idea. He starts writing about it in the American Mercury in the early 50s, and then much more extensively while at National Review and in the book In Defense of Freedom. And oftentimes he's not using the term fusionism at this point, but it becomes a word that his friend and debating partner Brent Bozell would often sort of apply in a mocking way to what he was doing. But Frank came up with the term. And, ultimately, I would say the ultimate expression of fusionism is in defense of freedom. And there it becomes more complex. And he basically, it's a very libertarian document. So you say, what is his relationship with libertarians? If you ask someone like Murray Rothbard, he thought, other than the anti-communism, Frank was a libertarian, plain and simple. As the 1960s wears on, Frank is alarmed by the disorder, by the drug use, by the crime, by the assassinations. And he starts sounding a little bit more like a law and order guy. And so the Times, I don't know that they shifted his views, but his emphasis certainly shifted as the 1960s wore on. He had a very good relationship with Brent Bozell. They had a debate. And so someone looking at the debate might see, whoa, these guys must hate each other. Well, the letters that I found, Bozell is laughing about this and saying, if Buckley doesn't print this stuff, I'm out of here. I'm resigning. Let's if he doesn't print it, let's do it when he's away in Switzerland, and let's sneak it into the magazine. He's plotting this with Meyer. And so it's not like he's going after Meyer. Meyer knows what's coming. And Bozell says, I'm going to read you out of the conservative movement. I'm going to excommunicate you. And they're laughing about it. With other debating partners, it wasn't as cordial. So someone like Russell Kirk, Meyer, in 1955, another one of those brash things, in the mid-1950s, he writes kind of a hit piece on Russell Kirk, or at least his ideas, in The Freeman. And him and Frank Chodorow are plotting this. What I found is that Buckley knew about it, that Bill Buckley knew this was coming, that he consulted Meyer about it, and that Chodorow was plotting it. And at the same time, Meyer had received a grant from the Volcker Fund to write a book based on this attack on not just Russell Kirk, but what was thought of at the time as the new conservatives. Russell Kirk said, I have my spies too. And they're telling me that this is happening. And he says this to Henry Regnery. And Henry Regnery said, who would publish that book? No one's going to publish that book. Well, it turns out Henry Regnery has a falling out with Kirk years later. And when that book 7 years later comes out, it comes out under the auspices of Regnery. So who would publish it? Henry Regnery published it. Kirk, softened to Meyer a bit. But even something as simple as Bill Buckley trying to get him on the masthead of National Review, he looked and Frank Chodorow and Frank Meyer on the masthead and he said, I'm not going cheek by jowl with those two. You're not going to put me next to my name next to those two guys' name. And Buckley said, there has been a unilateral obsession about this feud, meaning that it was Kirk who was sort of obsessed with Meyer, and Meyer really didn't think much of it. It would fade a little bit for Kirk. Kirk would feed when Meyer had something called the Exchange, which was sort of a message board for conservatives to place them in academia. Kirk would be a funnel of names to Meyer. And later, Kirk said in his autobiography that, well, maybe I didn't appreciate him enough at the time because when Frank Meyer was, say what you want about him, when he was the editor of Books, Arts, and Manners at National Review, when he was the literary editor, he would review my books and he would publish reviews by me. When he left, that happened less and less and less. And so I think he even came to appreciation of him, but it wasn't as though Kirk and Meyer were ever friends the way Bozell and Meyer were friends. You just wouldn't get that impression from the magazine. Meyer was friendly with Harry Jaffa, and they had this big knockdown, drag-out fight in National Review. But there was a sense in which you could remain friends with someone and still have these, deep philosophical disagreements with them.
The conservative movement, indeed, in the post-war era was characterized not necessarily by factionalism, but certainly by differing philosophies that were in conversation with one another. And that conversation could be very intense and even at times, sometimes collegial, but also sometimes not so collegial. We've mentioned several names here, and I just wanted to sort of draw a map of how these people relate to one another. Frank Chodorow, interestingly enough, is, of course, the founder of ISI. His idea is to create the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, which over time actually becomes a more traditionalist conservative organization called the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. So ISI's origins actually go back to Frank Chodorow. Frank Chodorow is a very hardcore libertarian. He is basically almost an anarchist, if not actually an anarchist. He was a friend of Albert J. Nock, who was a self-proclaimed anarchist. So Frank Chodorow is concerned in the early 1950s by the rise of a new Burkean conservatism. And the champion of this, who's best known, is Russell Kirk, who writes a book in 1953 called The Conservative Mind. But there are numerous others as well who are part of what's called the new conservatism in that era. And Chodorov selects Frank Meyer to be the person to anathematize and to, sort of write the counter argument against the new conservatives, trying to make the case for individualism or for a conservatism that is more libertarian and less traditionalist. Brent Bozell, who's another person you mentioned, is early on involved with National Review. He is, in fact, Bill Buckley's brother-in-law, so there's a very close connection there. They were classmates at Yale, Buckley and Bozell. And Bozell, over time, becomes what would today be characterized as something close to a Catholic integralist, and is someone who very much believes that America's founding, America's tradition and history is too liberal right from the beginning, and that in fact nothing short of a more purely Catholic society and Catholic politics is going to be sufficient to have a virtuous society. And Meyer and Bozell, who remain very good friends, they have this fascinating set of debates in the pages of National Review, where they're putting basically this integralist perspective that Bozell has against this more libertarian or, in some ways, Americanist version of conservatism that Frank Meyer has. And it's remarkable that they were able to do this while remaining friends. And the human part of your narrative really stands out, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I wanted to do. I think the more fascinating part of their conversation happens outside of National Review and these letters that I found. Bozell is a person who is essentially a Meyerite prior to going to Spain. I mean, he writes The Conscience of a Conservative.
Which is Barry Goldwater's book.
Which is Barry Goldwater's best-selling political book, which is very much in line with Frank Meyer, National Review, Bill Buckley-style conservatism. He goes to Spain, and there's an immediate change.
And this is Franco's Spain, I should point out.
This is Franco's Spain, and he writes Meyer a letter saying, you should come here too. The United States is defeated. It's no longer the country that's going to save the West. Spain will. I no longer want to be president of the United States. I want to be caudillo of Spain. And what of this is tongue-in-cheek and what is him being serious is hard to assess years later, but he clearly was serious about a lot of it. And Meyer says, well, what do you want to do about National Review? You want to run National Review from Spain? What are we going to do with Jim Burnham? Have him be the auxiliary of National Review in Kent? What are we going to tell Bill? What about the financial issues of all this? So Meyer doesn't join him, but obviously Kendall goes there first. Bozell goes there. Reed Buckley is over there. Frederick Williamson is over there.
I'll just mention these are numerous people involved with the conservative movement, with National Review in particular. So Bozell is Buckley's brother-in-law. Wilmore Kendall is a professor at Yale who was something of a mentor to both William F. Buckley and Brent Bozell. And Reed Buckley is younger brother of Bill Buckley. And Fritz Wilhelmsen is a very close friend of Brent Bozell's. By the way, you mentioned something interesting about Bozell, which is that, it's hard to tell whether he's joking about becoming caudillo of Spain or whether he's serious. One reason why it's hard to tell, of course, is that eventually it will come out that Brent Bozell does have a mental illness, that he seems to have bipolar condition.
Which when I asked people about, to a man, everyone said we didn't notice it in the 60s. And I always say, when did you first notice it? And it was hard to put a date on it for a lot of people. But I think by the 1970s, at a certain point, it became clear to most people. Now, how do those things happen? I don't know. That's a mystery to me. But that is certainly the case. But to me, what was interesting about the letters, and this is going to be the first time for a lot of people seeing this because these are letters that have been hidden for 60 years. Bozell, who wrote this book, Conscience of a Conservative, who worked for Barry Goldwater as a speechwriter, is the one within National Review that is calling him our Frankenstein. And they're worried about Goldwater if they had created a monster that's going to come back and bite them. And at a certain point, Meyer is worried about that too. Now, obviously, Meyer comes around by 1964. He's heavily in favor of Barry Goldwater for president, so much so that he's making these delusional predictions of him possibly winning in a landslide. But in 61 and 62, around that time, there were people within National Review, especially someone like Bozell, who was questioning whether they should be pushing a guy like Barry Goldwater, that's something I've never heard before. And I think it's one of the many things that that in the book that people will say, well, gee, this is a little bit shocking. I didn't know that part of the story.
We've talked a lot about Frank Meyer's arguments with traditionalist conservatives, but you mentioned that he also had his differences with libertarians like Murray Rothbard. And Rothbard in particular thought that Frank Meyer was almost a pure libertarian, except on foreign policy, because Frank Meyer was a very hawkish Cold Warrior. He was someone who believed that you did have to have conscription, and you did have to have I believe conscription.
Meyer didn't believe in. Meyer was on an anti-conscription committee, but it was a little bit too complex to say he was against. Like, there might have been certain situations where he was for it and against it. However, during the Vietnam War, he was against the draft.
Okay, I recall there were nuances to his thought there, but in general, he was in favor of a very strong stand against the Soviet Union, a military position against the Soviet Union. Even I think you mentioned at one point in conversations we've had elsewhere, preemptive military nuclear
possibility of that. Yes, I mean, he also thought. I mean, he was a truther on Sputnik. In the office, he thought that the Soviet. He thought they were such liars that they had made this up. And so with a guy like Rothbard, and Rothbard in these letters says, well, I'm an old right guy. He thinks of himself as an old right guy.
This is more of a conservative or someone on the right in the pre-World War II era, more of a what's pejoratively called an isolationist.
Yes, and Rothbard, unlike Meyer and so many of the other people that were in that National Review crowd, he was never a left-winger. He was always kind of a Republican. He never made the conversion. He was always had those type of views. And so Rothbard also is another guy that remained friends with him, but he critiqued Meyer harshly at various times because of his anti-communism. And Meyer, in a very general way, would criticize libertarians without naming names, really, because he liked a lot of these people, that they, were joining things like the SANE, like the anti-nuclear group, the disarmament group. And he thought that these people had gone crazy because for him, his world was shaped by communism. He saw it. He was in the belly of the beast. He worked for the guy who created the Berlin Wall. I mean, he knew people. One of the first people he knew in the Communist Party died in a gulag. He knew people that died fighting for communists. He knew people that were murdered by communists. So he knew communism in and out, and he thought of it as a profound moral evil. And, just to give you one example, I mean, Henry Kissinger wrote him in '68 when he was the incoming national security advisor for Richard Nixon. He said, what should we do, Frank, about foreign policy? And Frank said, well, of course, we have to act in our national interests in a very, very strict sense in our national interest. We're in a weird spot because there's this disorienting force called the Soviet Union that is a messianic crusader state that is out to convert the world to its view of living. And we can't have that. That's going to destroy freedom everywhere. So we're in this unique spot where we have to stand against them everywhere. But if there were no Soviet Union, the Vietnam War would be a farce, foreign aid would be a farce, the United Nations would be a farce, NATO would be a farce. All of these things would be ridiculous without the existence of the Soviet Union. So he had a very complex view of foreign policy where on the surface, he was a complete anti-communist, almost like a Dr. Strangelove caricature of an anti-communist. But you scratch that surface and you see that there's something else below it, that he knew that the sensible foreign policy absent the Soviet Union is sort of what we had pre-Roosevelt. And I think that governs his view, not just of foreign policy, but of economic policy, that he wanted not so much a revolution as a restoration of what was before Roosevelt. In fact, his last major speech he gave to the Philadelphia Society in 1971, he said the way that conservatives that came up in the post-war, what united us all, and Frank was all about trying to unite people, but what united us all was an opposition to Roosevelt. And I think that's why Frank was sort of anti-Eisenhower, because Eisenhower said, he made his truce with the New Deal. And Frank never made his truce with the New Deal. He wanted to upend the New Deal, but he also wanted to upend the foreign policy that came about because of Roosevelt as well.
So absent the context of the Cold War, which of course has been over now for more than 30 years, Frank Meyer actually had many of the sympathies that the old right had in foreign policy. And in fact, he had a view of foreign policy that might be similar in some ways to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement today. So in many respects, Frank Meyer is not just a figure out of the past, but is someone whose thought is still relevant for conservatives today, whether they're fusionists or whether they're even MAGA conservatives re-examining foreign policy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always hard to take someone 60 years ago and say, this is what they would believe now. So we, in a sense, this is just hypotheticals, but I think it's not so much a hypothetical on foreign policy. He would very much fit in with what Trump's outlook is on foreign policy. On immigration, and some of the letters that I saw, he's accused by Rose Wilder Lane, who wants sort of unlimited.
And Rose Wilder Lane is a old right libertarian.
Yes.
She is the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who writes Little House on the Prairie.
Yes, and so she's very much comes out of this sort of 1920s and 1930s old right. And she's sort of, I don't want to say she's an irrelevant person by the 50s, but she's not as relevant as she once was. In fact, she refuses writing opportunities because people want a Social Security number for her, and she doesn't want that. She doesn't want a Social Security number. So anyhow, she accuses Frank of being a restrictionist on immigration. And now whether that meant that Frank legally wanted to sort of restrict immigration, I don't know. But he thought culturally it had done damage, that much immigration had done damage to the country that weren't able to absorb it. So in certain ways, he would fit in very nicely with the Trump people. And in other ways, I mean, he clearly was not a populist. He didn't like the word. He didn't, he was against that kind of thing. But at the same time, when he is advising Jim Buckley, who's Bill Buckley's brother, who ran for Senate as a Conservative Party candidate in New York, Meyer had helped found the Conservative Party in New York. And in 1970, this quixotic run by Jim Buckley, he won as a third party candidate for Senate. And Meyer said to him, listen, you got to go after these union people. You got to go after these Democrat votes. You can't just rely on traditional Republican votes. You have to reach out to these disaffected Democrats. So in that sense, in an applied way, he is going for that populist electoral strategy. But I think he would never want to call himself a populist, but obviously what he was doing was very much the game plan that, Reagan relied on, and more extensively, people like Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump relied on much later.
So there is so much more that we could discuss. This book really it's a history of an important figure in the conservative movement, both historically, but also even for today's debates about what conservatism means. It's a book that is a remarkable window into 20th century history, not just in politics, not just in America and in Britain, but also a literary side of the world with respect to Joan Didion and Eugene O'Neill and
Star Trek, Bob Dylan.
Well, that's right. There's even Theodore Sturgeon, who is an important figure in the development of Star Trek's mythos, is a friend of Frank Meyer's, and as are a number of other science fiction authors. There's so much in this book that we can't possibly get into in one podcast, but that just means that we should have you back on and have a further discussion. And most of all, it means that our viewers should check out The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank Meyer by Daniel J. Flynn.
Thank you so much.